A number of years ago, I had a 16-year-old catcher who was referred to me because he couldn't make the routine throw back to the pitcher. He'd either spike it into the ground or throw it a good 10 feet over the pitcher's head. What ended up happening for him, if you look at his history, which is not at all uncommon when we're talking about repetitive performance problems, is that the fall before, he was in a game, he was first at bat in the first inning, and he caught a fastball on his right forearm. He was a right-handed catcher, and it ended up breaking his forearm, and he really didn't know that at the time. His coach had looked at his forearm, said, "You're good to go," and he spent the entire game throwing the ball back to the pitcher in excruciating pain. Now, our bodies and our nervous systems memorize pain and painful movements. And every time he went back to throw that ball back, his body, his nervous system was memorizing that experience. At the end of the game, his dad took him to the ER. He got an x-ray. Sure enough, his right forearm had been broken. They set it. Everything was fine. Ends up coming back in January for the start of spring practice indoors. And he's catching for a pitcher. Coach is standing right next to the pitcher. A very crowded space, because usually when you're warming up again in the Northeast, indoors in the winter, not a whole lot of room. Gym was small. His very first throw back since the cast being taken off, almost hits the coach in the head. Coach gives this kid the evil eye. Kid starts feeling freaked out and anxious because he doesn't know where that throw came from. He had no control over it. His second throw almost hits the coach again. The coach at that point says something really nasty and demeaning to the kid. The kid gets even more anxious, and after three more bad throws, has to excuse himself, tells the coach he's not feeling well. Goes home that night, is feeling more and more anxious, and the next day was worse, and the next day after that was worse, until he couldn't even play catch with his dad without losing control. Now, repetitive performance problems, when you look at them real carefully, what you're going to find is oftentimes there's a history in the athlete's experience, either in or out of the sport, of upsetting events, what I call trauma. Not necessarily capital T trauma, but an injury, a scary close call, or something that was emotionally upsetting. And that forms the basis of these kinds of performance problems, operating out of awareness. The athlete's not aware of it. I'm Dr. Alan Goldberg. I'm a sports performance consultant. I work with athletes across every level, in every sport, and one of my specialties is helping athletes overcome performance fears and blocks, and dealing with these repetitive performance problems. This is the second in a series of videos I want to do on helping athletes understand these repetitive performance problems, where they come from, and how to work with them. And when this catcher went to throw the ball back to the pitcher without knowing it, every time he was doing that, his nervous system was remembering that this motion, the throwing motion, was unsafe. It was dangerous. See, our nervous systems as mammals have one thing in mind. There's one thing that's important to them. It's not about throwing the ball back to the pitcher. It's not about nailing a tumbling pass, planting the pole in the plant box if you're a vaulter, getting the bat off your shoulders and taking a good swing. Your nervous system only cares about survival. Your nervous system cares about safety. And so it will memorize experiences that were dangerous or threatening in one way or the other. And even if there's no logic to it, it doesn't matter, because your nervous system does not care about logic. And when you're in that situation again, your nervous system will confuse today, his arm had healed, it was stronger than ever, with what things feel like from the past. So every time he cocked his arm and got ready to throw the ball back, his nervous system was back in the past with that injury and every time you throw, you're going to be in pain. And what ends up happening is our nervous system automatically, reflexively, goes into a self-protective response. Fight, flight, or in this situation where he really couldn't fight or flee, we go into freeze. And when we go into freeze, we lose control of our body. Our trained performance skills go offline. And that's what was happening with him. He could not even feel his forearm when he was throwing. So these kinds of performance problems oftentimes operate out of an athlete's awareness. And what's really important to understand is our nervous system is controlling what's happening, not our mind. Okay, and I mentioned in the first video, a lot of times, athletes get labeled as head cases, they're choke artists, they're mentally weak, when these problems are actually biological in nature. And they're caused by this past experience, or they're triggered, I should say, by this past experience. And the athlete automatically going back into a freeze response. Because that's probably exactly what happened after he was injured and his arm was broken. And every time he went to throw the ball in pain, his system shut down. He was in freeze. So what's really important to understand is that these problems, we have to learn to listen to our nervous systems, because our nervous systems are a guide. I mentioned in the first video, our nervous systems are a compass. Now, what do I mean by that? If you're struggling performance-wise, if you're in freeze, and when you are, your trained skills get kicked offline, the job that you need to learn to do is to learn to lower the nervous system's response to stress. Meaning you have to learn to take steps backwards so you end up feeling safer. Okay? Because as long as your nervous system is experiencing a threat and you're in danger, the performance problem is going to continue. Now, one of the first steps for an athlete in learning to work with the nervous system and learning to control how activated you get, how anxious or how nervous you get, is you have to understand what the signs are that your nervous system is getting activated, getting amped up. And one of the main signs, of course, is physiological. As our nervous system revs up in response to danger, we start experiencing physiological changes. Heart rate increases, breathing gets faster and shallower, muscles tighten, stomach starts to get wonky. We might even notice our throat gets dry, our hands and fingers, our toes and feet get cold. So one major sign of activation is the physical. Second major sign is what happens mentally. So as we get activated, our nervous system kind of triggers our mind to start racing. We start overthinking, we start focusing on things that we don't want to have happen, we start entertaining the what ifs, and along with that we may or may not be aware of accompanying imagery. Like when we say, oh my God, what if this happens? Sometimes unknowingly there are images in our mind of that happening. Or we might be replaying images from a past upsetting event. So, physiological signs, the mental signs, and the third sign we're getting activated is we start experiencing emotion. Nervousness or anxiety, frustration, anger, sadness, excitement. Now, what's really critical is that we're aware of the signs of this activation, because if you're aware that your system's revving up, if you catch it early enough, there are things you can do to ride the wave of that activation until it comes down. Because one thing about your nervous system is it was built to get activated in the face of danger, deal with the danger, and then come down. Your nervous system does not want to stay in that highly activated state because it's a waste of energy. Okay, so the nervous system itself wants to come down. And the way you can learn to consistently get that nervous system to do what it wants to do is by focusing on the physiological signs of the activation. Now, this takes skill It takes practice, because most of us, when we get scared, when we get frustrated and angry, when we get what I'm calling activated, we go right after the thoughts. Our mind starts racing, we jump into the thoughts, we get caught up with the content of them. Oh my God, what if that happens? What if this happens? Oh, now I'm remembering when it did happen. And the problem is if you get activated and you allow yourself to focus on the mental signs, the images that are attached to it, or all of this thinking. And I should also point out, if you allow yourself also to go to the emotions, how angry or frustrated or nervous you are, what ends up happening is you're actually throwing logs on the fire of that activation. You're going to get more and more anxious, you're going to get more and more revved up until you end up going into freeze. And what you have to learn to discipline yourself to do, and this takes practice, easier said than done right here, is you have to learn when you get activated to go right after what's going on physically in your body. So you notice you're starting to get scared, your heart's racing, and what I teach athletes to do is have a very curious, relaxed response to that activation. Oh, I'm getting activated, my heart rate's accelerating. And what you have to learn to do is turn it over to your nervous system, because remember, your nervous system doesn't want to stay up there. It wants to do that activation followed by deactivation. And if with curiosity, you notice your heart rate's up and it's increasing and you go, oh, I'm getting activated. My heart rate is up. What does it want to do? Does it want to increase, decrease, stay the same, or change? And if you approach it without trying to do anything, but you just, quote, listen to the heart rate or the muscle tension or whatever you're feeling, the butterflies in your stomach, what will happen over a 2 or 3 minute period of time is your heart rate might start increasing more, might increase even more. At some point it will level off, and then all by itself, it will settle. When you get activated, anxious, nervous, frustrated, angry, and you ask yourself, where do I notice it in my body? And you take time with curiosity to just explore it and let it do its thing, within 2 minutes, what goes up always comes down. And like I said before, most athletes don't do this. They don't know how to do this, and instead they go after their thoughts. So this is a trained skill, and what I want to teach you to do is when you do have those thoughts, the negative thinking, the what ifs, all of that stuff, it's nothing more than a sign that your system's getting activated. It's normal. And you want to be able to learn to let the thoughts just go and instead ask yourself, oh, when I have that thought, now what do I notice inside? Okay? And again, by training yourself to isolate the physical signs of the activation and just stay with them with curiosity, you'll be able to learn to control this. Now again, like I said, this takes practice. And obviously, in the middle of a performance, we're not going to have you doing this. I'm going to talk about other strategies that you'd use if you notice you're getting activated in the middle of a performance. What I'm talking about right now, where we what's called track or follow the activation in our body, has to happen the night before, the day of, an hour before, even 20 minutes or 10 minutes before. When you have time and you don't have to divert your focus from the action. If you found this video helpful, and again, this is just the second in a series, and I'm going to be layering what to do next onto this. Sign up for my YouTube channel, hit the bell icon, I'll let you know when the next video is coming up. Leave me your comments and questions. Again, appreciate your watching. Stay safe as you hopefully re-enter your sport during this pandemic, and we'll be talking soon.